Blood ran down her temple as she clutched his arm. Her voice was small but desperate, cutting through the silence like a knife. "My mama's bleeding badly." The crystal glasses stopped midair. Forks hovered above plates. All eyes turned to the child, and then to the man she dared to touch. Because this wasn't just any man. This was Sebastian Vale, the most ruthless mafia boss the city had ever known. And his response would change everything. Stick around, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, let's get into this incredible story. The private dining room at the Reserve hummed with controlled power on that autumn evening. This wasn't a restaurant that took walk-ins or advertised its location. You had to know someone to know it existed at all. And if you were lucky, or unlucky enough to secure a table here, you understood the rules without being told. Keep your voice low, keep your business private, and never under any circumstances interrupt the man at the corner table. Sebastian Vale commanded that corner like a king on his throne. At 39, he had carved out an empire through equal parts intelligence and intimidation. His dark hair was swept back with precision, his beard meticulously groomed, his pinstripe suit tailored to perfection. Everything about him screamed control. His associates sat around him like a war council, discussing shipments and territories with the same casual tone others might use to discuss the weather. This was Sebastian's ritual. Every Thursday evening, same room, same table, same ruthless efficiency. He had built his reputation on predictability and precision. Those who worked for him knew where they stood. Those who crossed him learned what happened when you disrupted the natural order of things. He operated by a simple philosophy that had kept him alive in a business where most men didn't see 40. Emotion was a liability, attachments was weakness, and the moment you let someone matter, you gave your enemies a target. For 15 years, Sebastian had adhered to this code without deviation. He ate alone, slept alone, trusted no one completely. It wasn't a life that left room for softness, but it was a life that left him breathing. Tonight should have been no different. Numbers needed reviewing, a dispute over waterfront access required his verdict, a supplier in the Eastern District had been skimming percentages and needed to be reminded why that was unwise. The conversation flowed like clockwork, each man at the table playing his role in the machine Sebastian had built. But then the doors exploded inward. The crash echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. Conversation strangled mid-sentence. Wine glasses froze halfway to lips. Even the waiter carrying a tray of espresso stopped so abruptly the cups rattled in their saucers. Every head swiveled toward the entrance, where the maitre d' stood paralyzed, his face drained of color. He reached out uselessly, mouth opening and closing without sound, as if trying to explain the impossible. Because standing just inside those heavy doors, trembling and gasping for breath, was a child. She couldn't have been older than 7. Her light-colored dress was torn at the shoulder and smudged with dirt. Fresh blood streaked her forehead and temple, matting strands of blonde hair to her face. Her knees were scraped raw, as if she'd fallen multiple times getting here. Tears had carved clean lines through the grime on her cheeks, and her chest heaved with the kind of breathless panic that comes from running until your lungs burn. The room transformed into a tableau of shock. The patrons stared at her as if she were a ghost that had wandered in from another world entirely. Some looked disturbed by the intrusion into their carefully cultivated atmosphere of exclusivity. Others seemed annoyed, as if a bleeding child was merely an inconvenience interrupting their veal piccata. A few glanced away entirely, unwilling to acknowledge what they were seeing. But Rosie Whitmore wasn't looking at them. Her wild, desperate eyes swept across the room, searching, looking for power, looking for someone who could actually help instead of just pretend to care. And then she found him. Maybe it was the way the men at his table sat a little straighter, a little more attentive. Maybe it was the expensive watch that caught the chandelier light, or the way even the servers gave his corner a wide berth of respect. Or maybe it was something primal, the way a drowning person recognizes the only piece of driftwood in an endless ocean. Without hesitation, without thought for protocol or propriety or the danger radiating from that corner like heat from a furnace, Rosie ran. Her small shoes pounded against the hardwood floor, the sound impossibly loud in the suffocating silence. Sebastian's bodyguards straightened instantly, hands sliding toward concealed weapons. This violated every rule of this world. No one rushed Sebastian Vale. No one touched Sebastian Vale without invitation. But the little girl didn't know the rules of this world, or didn't care. She reached his table and grabbed his forearm with both blood-smeared hands. Her tiny fingers gripped the fabric of his $1,000 suit jacket like it was the only solid thing left in a universe that had tilted sideways. And then she said the words that would crack the foundation of everything Sebastian Vale had built to protect himself. "My mama's bleeding badly." The silence that crashed down was absolute, not a breath, not a whisper, not the clink of silver on china. The entire room held still, as if time itself had paused to witness what would happen next. Because everyone in that room knew Sebastian Vale's reputation. They knew he was a man who showed no mercy, who crushed threats without hesitation, who had built his empire on the bodies of those foolish enough to challenge him or waste his time. They knew he was untouchable, unreachable, a man who had deliberately cut away every soft part of himself until only the steel remained. And now they waited to see what that man would do with a desperate child clinging to his arm. To understand what happened in that moment, you need to understand who Sebastian Vale was before a blood-stained girl shattered his carefully constructed world. Sebastian didn't become the most feared man in the city by accident. He built his empire brick by brick, decision by calculated decision, eliminating variables and vulnerabilities with the precision of a surgeon removing tumors. Every move was deliberate, every word was measured, every relationship was transactional. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was survival. He had learned early that this world devoured the weak. At 16, he'd watched his mentor make the fatal mistake of trusting a childhood friend. By 17, Sebastian attended the funeral and learned the lesson. Trust was a luxury men in his position couldn't afford. Love was a weapon someone would eventually use against you. Family made you predictable, and predictable men ended up in the ground or behind bars. So Sebastian became unpredictable by becoming nothing. No wife to threaten, no children to kidnap, no elderly parents to pressure. He existed as a pure force of will and strategy, untethered to anyone or anything that could be leveraged. His associates respected him, his enemies feared him, but no one truly knew him, and that was exactly how he wanted it. His routine reflected this philosophy. Every Thursday at 8, he occupied the corner table at the reserve. The location was strategic, back to the wall, clear sight lines to both exits, enough distance from the other tables that conversations remained private. He always ordered the same meal, a rare steak, no sauce, vegetables steamed, not roasted, a single glass of red wine that he never quite finished. Predictable in schedule, but controlled in every detail. During these Thursday meetings, Sebastian ran his organization with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. Ledgers were reviewed, disputes were arbitrated, problems were solved before they became crises. He never raised his voice, because he never needed to. A slight tightening of his jaw meant someone had disappointed him. A long pause before responding meant you should reconsider what you just said. His lieutenants had learned to read these signals the way sailors read the wind. Tonight had begun like every other. Marcus reported on the shipment schedules, Tony outlined the resolution to a territory dispute in the warehouse district, Vincent, no relation to any other Vincent, Sebastian employed him for competence, not nostalgia, provided updates on their legitimate business fronts. Everything was proceeding according to plan, every number aligning precisely where Sebastian had projected it would be. He had just cut into his steak, the knife sliding through the meat with satisfying ease, when the doors burst open. And in that single moment, everything Sebastian Vale had built to protect himself became meaningless in the face of a desperate child's desperate plea. For a man who had built an empire on calculated decisions, what Sebastian did next defied every principle he'd lived by for 20 years. He stood. The chair scraped back with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the suffocating silence. His napkin fell from his lap to the floor, forgotten. The knife and fork remained crossed on a plate of food that would go cold and uneaten. Around him, his lieutenants exchanged glances that communicated a single shared thought. What is he doing? Marcus recovered first, his voice low and urgent. Sir, this could be a setup. We should secure the perimeter, verify her story, check for... I'm on my way. Sebastian's voice cut through the objection like his words were physical things. Not loud, not harsh, simply absolute. 3 words that made no sense in the context of who Sebastian Vale was supposed to be. 3 words that violated every protocol, every security measure, every lesson learned in blood about staying 2 steps removed from anything that could compromise his position. 3 words that should never have left his mouth in response to a strange child's plea. But they had, and now the entire room was witnessing Sebastian Vale do the impossible. He stepped around the table, and the girl's hands released his arm only to immediately grab for his hand instead. Her small fingers wrapped around 2 of his with desperate strength, as if she feared that letting go meant losing her only lifeline. Sebastian didn't pull away, didn't shake her off, didn't even hesitate. Where? His question was directed at the child, his full attention on her, as if the room full of shocked observers had ceased to exist. The shop, Rosie managed through gasping breaths. Mama's shop. They came and they... Her voice broke, words dissolving into a sob that came from somewhere deep and primal. Sebastian's jaw tightened, the only outward sign of the cold fury beginning to crystallize in his chest. He turned to Marcus, and when he spoke, every man in the room recognized the tone. This was Sebastian Vale in mission mode, the voice that preceded action and left no room for debate. Get the car, now. Tony, call Dr. Chen. Tell him it's priority. Vincent, I want eyes on every camera between here and the waterfront district. Find out who did this. His men moved instantly, the machine responding to its commander even as confusion flickered across their faces. Sebastian was already walking toward the exit, the blood-stained child's hand still clutched in his, leaving behind his meal, his meeting, his carefully maintained routine. The maitre d' stood frozen by the door, mouth agape. Sebastian brushed past him without acknowledgement. Behind them, the dining room erupted in whispers, shocked, scandalized, utterly baffled. This wasn't how men like Sebastian Vale operated. This wasn't the move of someone who valued control above all else. But as Sebastian pushed through the doors into the cold night air, Rosie stumbling alongside him, trying to match his longer strides, he wasn't thinking about reputation or protocol or the fortress of isolation he'd spent 2 decades building. He was thinking about a 7-year-old girl with blood on her hands and terror in her eyes, and someone was going to answer for putting both there. The black Mercedes cut through the night like a blade, Marcus behind the wheel pushing every yellow light and treating stop signs as suggestions. In the back seat, Sebastian kept his hand steady as Rosie gripped it with both of hers, her small body pressed against the door as she stared out the window, willing the car to move faster. "Left here," she gasped, pointing with a trembling finger. "The blue building, with the flowers painted on the window." The waterfront district had seen better decades. These streets belonged to working people, immigrants and families who kept their heads down and their doors locked after dark. The kind of neighborhood where violence was supposed to stay theoretical, something that happened in other parts of the city where men like Sebastian conducted their business. Not here. Never here. But as the Mercedes pulled up to a narrow shop wedged between a laundromat and a closed bodega, Sebastian saw immediately that someone had violated that unspoken boundary. The shop's front door hung open, one hinge twisted at an ugly angle. Shattered glass from the window glittered on the sidewalk like scattered diamonds, catching the streetlight. The painted flowers Rosie had mentioned, cheerful daisies and sunflowers that must have taken hours to create, were now marred by a spider web of cracks radiating from an impact point. Something heavy had hit that window. Or someone. Before Marcus could put the car in park, Rosie had the door open and was running. Sebastian followed, his expensive shoes crunching over glass as he crossed the threshold into what had been someone's livelihood and was now a crime scene. The smell hit him first. Iron and copper, the unmistakable scent of blood, still fresh. Beneath it, turpentine and old paint, the ghost of whatever craft had been practiced here. His eyes adjusted to the dim interior, lit only by a single bulb dangling from the ceiling. The shop had been modest but clearly loved. Hand-painted signs advertised alterations and repairs. A small counter held an old-fashioned register, its drawer hanging open and empty. Bolts of fabric lay scattered across the floor like casualties of war. And in the back, sprawled beside an overturned sewing machine, was Anna Whitmore. She lay on her side in a spreading pool of crimson, one arm stretched toward the door as if she tried to crawl after her daughter. Her face was a mess of bruises, one eye swollen shut. Blood matted her dark hair and soaked through her blouse from wounds Sebastian's experienced eye immediately cataloged as serious. Her breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps that spoke of internal damage. "Mama!" Rosie's scream cut through the shop as she dropped to her knees beside her mother, small hands hovering uselessly as if afraid to cause more harm by touching. Sebastian was already on his phone. "Jen, I'm at 247 Waterfront, between 5th and 6th. Trauma, multiple contusions, possible internal bleeding. You have 5 minutes." He ended the call without waiting for confirmation. Dr. Chen knew better than to be late when Sebastian called in a favor. He knelt beside Anna, his fingers finding the pulse point at her neck, weak but present. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with pain and shock. Anna's lips moved, trying to form words that wouldn't come. Her good eye fixed on Rosie for a moment, then rolled towards Sebastian with a confusion that bordered on delirium. She was trying to ask who he was, trying to understand why a stranger in a $3,000 suit was kneeling in her blood on the floor of her shop. "Don't try to talk," Sebastian said, his voice carrying an unexpected gentleness that would have shocked anyone from the reserve. "Help is coming. You're going to be fine." It was a lie. She might not be fine. The amount of blood pooling beneath her, the shallow breathing, the way her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, Sebastian had seen enough violence to know this woman was balancing on a razor's edge between survival and bleeding out on this floor before dawn. But Rosie didn't need to hear that truth, so Sebastian made his voice certain, made it a command rather than a hope, as if he could will this woman to survive through sheer force of authority. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his bulk blocking the streetlight. "Dr. Chen is 3 minutes out. Vincent says the cameras in the area are mostly broken or too low quality, but he's got something, says you'll want to see it." Later, Sebastian shrugged out of his suit jacket, the fabric worth more than a month's rent in this neighborhood. He folded it and carefully slid it under Anna's head, trying to make her more comfortable without moving her too much. "Right now, we focus on keeping her stable." He'd learned basic field medicine the way most people in his line of work did, through necessity and near misses. Pressure on the visible wounds, keep the victim calm, monitor breathing, don't let them slip into shock if you can help it. His hands worked with the same methodical precision he'd brought to everything, pressing a clean section of fabric torn from a nearby bolt against the worst of the bleeding on her side. Rosie knelt beside him, her small hand finding her mother's and squeezing with a desperate strength. "You're going to be okay, Mama. This man, he's helping. He's going to fix everything." The faith in that statement cut deeper than Sebastian expected. This child believed he could save her mother because he'd shown up in an expensive car and carried himself with authority. She had no idea who he was or what he'd done to earn the money that bought that car. She just knew he'd answered her plea when no one else would. Headlights swept across the broken window, and moments later Dr. David Chen burst through the door carrying 2 silver cases. He was 52, wire-thin, with surgeon's hands that could work miracles when properly motivated. Sebastian had saved his daughter from a kidnapping 8 years ago. Chen had been in his debt ever since, and Sebastian had never called it in. Until tonight. Chen took one look at Anna and dropped to his knees beside her, cases snapping open to reveal enough medical equipment to run a field hospital. How long has she been like this? 15 minutes since we arrived, maybe 30 since the attack, Sebastian said, moving aside to give the doctor room to work. Chen's hands were already moving, checking pupils, feeling for broken ribs, assessing damage with the speed of someone who'd done trauma work in war zones. "I need better light, and get that child out of here." Sebastian carried Rosie outside despite her protests, her small fists beating weakly against his chest as she cried to stay with her mother. He set her down gently on the hood of the Mercedes, still warm from the engine, and crouched to her eye level. "The doctor needs to work, and he can't do that with distractions. You did your job, you found help. Now let him do his." His voice carried the same certainty he'd used inside, the kind that made people believe because doubt wasn't an option he permitted. Rosie hiccuped, wiping her nose on her already ruined sleeve, but she nodded. Sebastian stayed with her, one hand on her shoulder, while Marcus made quiet phone calls, and Tony arrived with Vincent in tow. Vincent approached with a tablet, his expression grim. "Got something. You're not going to like it." Sebastian took the device, studying the grainy footage from a convenience store camera 2 blocks over. 3 men, mid-20s, dressed in cheap leather and cheaper attitudes. They walked with the swagger of people who thought intimidation was the same as power. The timestamp showed them heading toward the waterfront district 40 minutes ago, one of them counting a thin stack of bills and laughing. "They hit 2 other shops tonight," Vincent continued, keeping his voice low. "Broke into a pawn shop on 3rd, beat the owner when he couldn't open the safe fast enough, smashed up a corner market on 7th. The owner there was smart enough to just hand over the cash. But Anna fought back," Sebastian said quietly, understanding crystallizing like ice in his veins. "Looks that way. Witnesses say they heard her yelling at them to get out, that she'd already been robbed twice this month and had nothing left to take. They didn't like that answer." Sebastian's jaw tightened. These weren't professionals, weren't even competent criminals. They were parasites, the kind of bottom feeders who preyed on working people because they were too incompetent to operate in the world where real power lived. The kind who saw an immigrant woman running a small shop and thought she was easy prey. They had no idea about territories or protocols, didn't know that certain neighborhoods were off limits, that the waterfront district had been under unofficial protection for years precisely because it was where civilians tried to build honest lives. There were rules in Sebastian's world. Brutal rules, yes, but rules that kept the chaos contained. You didn't hurt innocents. You didn't beat mothers in front of their children. You didn't destroy someone's livelihood for the $80 in their register. These men hadn't just committed robbery. They'd violated the fundamental order that kept this city from descending into complete savagery. "Where are they?" Sebastian asked. Tony stepped forward, phone still pressed to his ear. "Got a location. They're holed up in a warehouse in the industrial district, bragging about their haul in some dive bar an hour ago, probably sleeping it off now." Sebastian looked back at the shop where Dr. Chen worked to save a woman whose only crime was trying to protect what little she had. Then he looked down at Rosie, whose blood-stained dress and hollow eyes would haunt him long after tonight ended. "Round them up," Sebastian said, his voice carrying the cold finality of a death sentence. "All three. I want them in the warehouse on Porter Street, alive." Marcus nodded, already moving. How much damage? Sebastian's smile was a terrible thing to witness. Enough that they understand what lines they crossed. The warehouse on Porter Street had once processed textiles before the manufacturing jobs fled overseas. Now it served as neutral ground for Sebastian's organization, a place where problems got solved away from prying eyes, the kind of place that swallowed sounds and kept secrets. By the time Sebastian arrived 2 hours later, his men had already done the preliminary work. The three thugs hung from chains attached to overhead beams, their feet barely touching the concrete floor. Their bravado from earlier had evaporated along with any illusions about talking their way out of this situation. Blood dripped from split lips and broken noses, just enough to ensure they understood this wasn't a conversation between equals. Sebastian walked across the empty floor, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He'd left his ruined jacket at the shop, but his white shirt remained pristine despite the night's chaos. Behind him, Marcus and Tony flanked the entrance, while Vincent stood in the shadows with a camera. Everything was documented in Sebastian's world, insurance against future complications. The one in the middle, the leader, judging by how the other two kept glancing at him for guidance that wouldn't come, tried to summon defiance. "Do you know who you're messing with? We're connected. You can't just—" Sebastian's backhand was almost casual, but it snapped the man's head to the side hard enough to spray blood across the concrete. The warehouse fell silent except for the creak of chains and ragged breathing. "You're not connected," Sebastian said, his voice conversational, almost pleasant. "If you were connected, you'd know that the waterfront district has been under protection for 6 years. You'd know that the shops there pay a tax precisely so that people like you leave them alone. You'd know there are rules." He walked slowly around them, letting his words sink in. "In my world, we do terrible things. We hurt people, we break laws, but we have lines, boundaries that separate us from animals." He stopped in front of the leader. "You crossed those lines tonight." "It was just a robbery," one of the others whimpered. "She wouldn't hand over the money. We didn't mean—" "You beat a woman nearly to death in front of her 7-year-old daughter." Sebastian's voice remained calm, but something in his eyes made all three men flinch. That child had to run through the streets covered in her mother's blood, begging strangers for help because you wanted $80. He let that hang in the air, watching comprehension dawn across their faces. They were starting to understand that this wasn't about money or territory. This was about something far more personal. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to feel every ounce of pain you inflicted on Anna Whitmore, every bruise, every broken rib, every moment of terror. And when you're done understanding what you did, you're going to leave this city and never come back." The leader tried one last time. "You can't do this. We have rights." "You forfeited your rights when you put your hands on an innocent woman." Sebastian nodded to Marcus. "Make sure they remember. But I want them alive and capable of walking. They need to carry the message to anyone else who thinks the waterfront is easy prey." As he walked away, their screams began to echo off the warehouse walls. Anna Whitmore spent 3 weeks in a private recovery facility that didn't ask questions about how she'd gotten there or who was paying the bills. Dr. Chen visited daily, monitoring her progress with the same meticulous care he'd shown that first night. The broken ribs healed, the internal bleeding stopped, the bruises faded from purple to yellow to nothing. Sebastian visited twice. Both times he stayed in the doorway, never entering the room, as if proximity to her recovery might somehow contaminate it with his presence. Anna would wake to find flowers by her bedside, expensive arrangements that seemed absurdly out of place in the clinical setting. She never saw who brought them, but she knew. While Anna healed, Sebastian worked. The waterfront district had always been under nominal protection, but nominal wasn't enough anymore. He sent word through channels that mattered. The neighborhood was now under his personal watch. Any business operating there paid directly to him, and in exchange, they received something more valuable than police protection could ever offer: the certainty that predators would think twice before crossing into Sebastian Vale's territory. The pawn shop owner on 3rd reopened with a new security system and inventory he hadn't paid for. The corner market on 7th got a grant from an anonymous benefactor to repair the damage and upgrade their cameras. 6 other small businesses in the area suddenly found their protection fees waived indefinitely, replaced instead with actual protection. Sebastian's men became a visible presence on those streets, not as threats, but as guardians. They walked the blocks at night, their mere presence enough to redirect trouble elsewhere. Word spread quickly in the criminal underground. The waterfront district was off limits. The price for violating that boundary had been demonstrated in a warehouse on Porter Street, and no one wanted to be the next lesson. Anna's shop posed a different problem. The damage went beyond what insurance would cover, assuming she'd had insurance at all. The front window, the destroyed inventory, the register that had been pried open and thrown against the wall, it would take months to recover, maybe years, time a single mother with medical bills couldn't afford. Sebastian made a phone call. Within a week, contractors arrived to repair the damage. A new window went in, this one reinforced with security glass. New inventory appeared, bolts of fabric, threads, notions, all top quality, all marked as delivered to the wrong address and yours to keep. The register was replaced with a modern point-of-sale system that came with a year of technical support. When Anna finally returned home, supported by Rosie on one side and a hospital-issued cane on the other, she stood outside her shop for a full minute, staring at the transformation. The painted flowers had been restored, more beautiful than before. A small sign in the window read, "Whitmore Alterations," under new management, with a phone number she didn't recognize. Inside, an envelope waited on the counter. Anna opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a simple card with just 9 words, written in precise handwriting. "You owe nothing. This neighborhood is under protection." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Anna pressed the card to her chest and wept, not from fear or pain this time, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing that the man who'd answered her daughter's desperate plea had given her more than just her life back. He'd given her a future where she could rebuild without looking over her shoulder. 6 months after the night a blood-stained girl had shattered his carefully ordered world, Sebastian Vale sat in a small chair at a small table in the back room of Whitmore Alterations, drinking coffee that was slightly too bitter and perfectly acceptable. It had become a ritual. Every other Thursday, the Thursdays he didn't spend at the reserve conducting the business that paid for everything, he arrived at the shop just as Anna was closing. She would pour 2 cups of coffee from the pot she kept going all day, and they would sit in companionable silence while Rosie finished her homework at the cutting table. They never discussed that night. Anna had tried once, voice thick with gratitude and questions she needed answered. Sebastian had simply shaken his head, and she'd understood. Some debts couldn't be spoken aloud without diminishing them. Some acts of kindness were better honored through acceptance than explanation. Tonight, Rosie looked up from her math worksheet, pencil tucked behind her ear in imitation of how her mother held pins when she worked. "Mr. Sebastian, I made something for you." She scrambled down from her stool and retrieved a piece of construction paper from her backpack, presenting it with the solemn ceremony of a child offering treasure. Sebastian took it carefully, studying the crayon drawing with the same attention he'd give a contract worth millions. The picture showed 3 figures in front of a blue building with flowers on the window: a woman with dark hair, a small girl with a yellow dress, and a tall man in a dark suit with what appeared to be a cape flowing behind him. "That's you," Rosie explained, pointing at the caped figure. Mama says you're our guardian angel, but I thought angels should have capes instead of wings because wings don't make sense with suits. Sebastian stared at the drawing, at the oversized smile the little girl had given him, an expression he was fairly certain had never appeared on his actual face. The figure stood between the woman and child and what appeared to be scribbled darkness on the other side of the page, arms spread wide, as if shielding them. Is this how she saw him? Not as the man who'd sent 3 criminals to the hospital and driven them from the city with threats of worse. Not as the crime boss whose name made hardened criminals nervous, but as someone who stood between the light and the dark, choosing which side would win. "It's perfect," he said quietly, and meant it. Anna appeared from the front of the shop, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw the drawing and smiled, that soft, knowing smile that suggested she understood far more than Sebastian was comfortable with. "Will you stay for dinner?" she asked, as she had every visit for the past 3 months. "It's nothing fancy, just pasta, but there's plenty." Sebastian had refused every time before. Accepting felt like crossing another line, like admitting that he'd become attached to this small family in their small shop, like acknowledging that somewhere in the past 6 months, the fortress of isolation he'd built had developed a door, and these two had walked through it without permission. But tonight, looking at Rosie's drawing of a man with a cape who protected people, Sebastian realized he'd already crossed that line months ago. The fortress had been an illusion. You couldn't save someone's life and remain untouched by it. "Pasta sounds good," he said. And for the first time in 20 years, Sebastian Vale sat down to dinner with something that felt dangerously close to family.